Welcome. My name is Stephanie Chisholm, and I'm the Director of Education and Research at the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network. On behalf of BCAN and the World Bladder Cancer Patient Coalition, we're glad to have you join us for this discussion of bladder cancer, BCG, and COVID-19, a treatment and vaccine update for patients and their families. I'm joined today by two international experts in bladder cancer. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ashish Kamath. He's an endowed professor of urologic oncology and cancer research at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. So welcome, Dr. Kamath.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
And from Ireland, I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Haggerty. He is a urologist in Ireland, where he delivers service for genital malignancies in the Mater Misericordia University Hospital in Dublin. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
Excellent. He also delivers cancer and reconstructive care at the Mater private hospitals in Cork and Dublin. So welcome. We know that there's a lot of chatter going on in the internet, and installation of BCG into the bladder has long been used for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And the strain that's been approved in the United States is the Tice strain. A lot of folks have heard the buzz and the news about this vaccine that you are developing and going to be implementing in clinical trials. And can you explain very briefly for the viewers that are on here, how BCG for the bladder cancer treatments that's usually given typically over 6 weeks is being impacted by COVID-19 medical distancing issues, both in the US and the EU, respectively? Are you seeing any differences? Is it more of a regional thing? Are you telling patients it's okay to skip doses because it's better for them not to come in contact with the potential for COVID-19?
Yeah, so as our viewers and listeners probably know, we as part of BCAN, Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, got together really early, and thank you, Stephanie, for putting that together, and put out some guidelines that are on the website for patients and providers to look at. And furthermore, there have been refinements of those guidelines for bladder cancer patients, and there's a guideline out in Europe in urology that was online, in the latter part of last week. Essentially, to answer your question, as far as BCG for bladder cancer is concerned, we are strongly recommending that patients that have high-risk bladder cancer, so T1 high-grade, CIS of the bladder, do not skip any induction therapy with BCG. And they do not skip any of the first 3 weeks of the maintenance therapy. Once they're past that first initial 6+3, they have to weigh the risk of COVID-19 infection with the continued risk of going to the hospital and BCG. And that can, in many instances, be safely delayed by 1, 2, 3, even 4 months. But the initial part, the induction and the first booster course, is something that patients that have high-risk bladder cancer should clearly discuss with their urologist. And if they don't have access to it at their center, they should potentially seek referral to centers that can accommodate them. Because T1 high-grade bladder cancer, high-risk bladder cancer, it really doesn't wait. You can't wait for 2, 3, 4 months before treating it effectively. And that's what's been recommended in the US and Europe. Paul, what about your place? What's going on there?
Yeah, exact same. High risk disease, you still give the 6 and the 3 of the maintenance. After that, then it's individualized. We often individualize it for patients in any case. And so some patients have a bit of inflammation or side effects or symptoms and may have it deferred or have reduced doses on the subsequent maintenance doses. And so we've been doing this for years and have got a feel for it, but it's not always fully protocol driven. But I think the first 6+3 is where you get the maximal benefit to immunotherapy to the bladder.
Okay. So in the United States, we are only allowed to use the Tice BCG for treatment, right? Are there other options available in the EU, Dr. Haggerty? Different strains of BCG? Because we know there's a global shortage of the Tice BCG. Why?
There is, unfortunately, and urologists have been contending with that for a number of years now recently. We have a different brand called Medac, which is RIVM, which comes in a pre-pack, which can actually be made up on the spot. It doesn't require a separate pharmacist to do it, and so the urologist can do it on the day. having placed the catheter, then they follow through. And so that's what we are using. And there isn't a particular, there still has been a shortage even of this, but it hasn't reached the level of patients being denied anything.
Okay. Okay.
So Stephanie, if I might just clarify,
yep.
There's a shortage of BCG globally when it comes to the bladder cancer formulation. As you know, worked with folks all over the world, even in Japan, where the Tokyo strain is used, and of course they're helping us in the United States with the SWOG study with the Tokyo strain. Medx, a great company, and the RIVM, the Dutch strain that Paul, you just mentioned. I mean, that clearly works elsewhere, but there's a global shortage of BCG for bladder cancer use because it's so effective, and unfortunately we have so many patients that the production of BCG globally has not been able to keep pace with the requirement and demands for BCG, especially since many manufacturers in the US, Sanofi, went off the market. So manufacturers are going off the market with BCG rather than coming into the market. And that's a whole nother ballgame, and it has to do with reimbursement and things like that. So that's clearly not what we want to necessarily talk about, but there is a global shortage of BCG, and that's why we need more BCG globally.
Absolutely, and I know we have spoken to Merck, who is the primary manufacturer of the Tice strain of BCG, and they are at full capacity and have basically told us that they will continue to ensure that the bladder cancer community gets what they are able to produce, because that is most important. I did get a bunch of questions through our Inspire online community and others where a lot of patients and their families are either worried that because they might have this immune reaction with BCG, that they're either at greater risk of developing or suffering from COVID-19, or they also hear about this vaccine and they're thinking that they are now going to be immune and not at risk because they've had BCG. And your study about the vaccine is looking at, is it actually going to help reduce the risks of COVID-19? So they're thinking that they've had this BCG. Can you talk a little bit about the installation? And obviously, patients are aware that they have precautions they have to take when they void the BCG at home. They have to clean the area and the toilet and make sure that there's no BCG around so that anyone who might be immune compromised is not at any additional risk. What's the story? Is BCG a benefit or a risk or neutral because it's put into the bladder rather than a systemic BCG that you might get with a vaccine?
So there was a lot of questions in there, and let me address a few, and then I'll have my friend Paul address a few as well. So first off, the whole correlation between BCG and COVID-19 protection. Let me start that, and then Paul, I'll have you talk about the actual study. So the way that came about essentially is Mihai Nedia in the Netherlands and other groups around the world that have done TB and BCG studies for tuberculosis for decades have shown that tuberculosis vaccination not only protects people, and this is infants and children, but also elderly against tuberculosis, but also protects them against secondary infections. So there's a lower rate of infections with pneumonia, influenza, Staph aureus. And in well-done studies, randomized studies, small, but still randomized, they've shown that BCG vaccination will protect these folks against vaccination or challenge with viruses such as yellow fever. So that's data that's been known for a while in the TB world. When the COVID-19 came about, of course, the pandemic, and we were thinking of the BCG and all of that, one of the things that popped up as we were thinking about the protective effects of TB vaccination against other viruses, well, does it help against COVID-19? And there's a trial that was being developed in the US, and we call it the BADAS study, the BCG as defense against SARS. It's called the BRAVE study in Australia, and in the Netherlands, it is a study, but it doesn't have an acronym. But when we were thinking of this, one of the things that myself and Dr. Donardo at Baylor College of Medicine were thinking, well, could we look at the global response of BCG versus COVID-19? And I've known Paul Hagerty for years. I mean, he's a good friend of mine. We trained together. I had the pleasure of having something to do with him being a urologic oncologist as well. And I thought of no better person to reach out to because he has access to all these databases. And I literally just asked him, I said, Paul, would you be able to look at this and give us some scientific information based on the recurrence patterns? And he was able to kind of churn this out in literally 24, 48 hours. And Paul, let me turn it over to you so you can educate our viewers on what you found and the updated results as well. With the full caveat, of course, that this is still in press, so we don't want to, violate the journal confidentiality information and give too much away. But Paul can give you the higher level information.
So what we looked at, there's in the public arena, there is data available as to which countries have high level of compulsory BCG immunization at birth, and which countries do not. And straight away we saw that the countries in Europe that were being hit hardest by COVID-19 seemed to correlate negatively with whether they had BCG or not. So the countries that did not have BCG or had not had BCG for a long time seemed to have a much worse outcomes with regard to their, so that was the initial overall view. Then we took the data of 178 countries and territories and correlated those that had BCG, yes or no. And there was a few unknown. There's about 21 countries that don't have a BCG program. And when we looked at the incidence of COVID and the mortality, the death rate of the COVID, it was far higher in those countries. And of those who got the disease, what we call the case fatality rate is the number of deaths divided by the total number diagnosed. It was twice as high in the countries that did not have a BCG program. And we were quite flabbergasted with that. And so we decided to look at more detail at that, where we actually looked at countries, neighboring countries, ones with BCG, ones without, which had very similar health economics, lifestyle, life expectancy, smoking, other health parameters, other ways of measuring people's health. And again, we saw between 3 and 10 times higher death rate in those countries. And so, and we didn't find any country that jarred that did the opposite. And so it was very consistent. And we were very surprised at that. But we have to be careful that this is what we call an epidemiological study or an ecological study. And that means it's telling us about whole country, and it doesn't necessarily translate to an individual's risk. And so we can't definitely say that without examining this hypothesis in greater detail. And that's where Dr. Kamat's trial is going to hopefully give us the answers to that, and hopefully soon.
Okay.
And then the second part of that question that you raised, and I've had several patients and others ask, is that what about BCG that's given within the bladder? Does that protect people against COVID-19? From a mechanistic standpoint, I could say that there is no reason mechanistically and biologically that a intradermal vaccination or an exposure to intravesical therapy would have different effects as far as protective against rechallenged viruses. But clearly, as Dr. Hegarty mentioned, this is something that we hypothesize. It needs to be studied. It's not something that I would recommend going out and just assuming that because you've had BCG installation in the bladder, you're immune. And so don't drop your mask and don't stop washing your hands and don't do things like that. And we still need to be responsible stewards of this fight against the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great. And I know that there are different registries that are popping up, or different sites around the country that are contributing to a cancer and COVID registry. Are they tracking, do you know, for whether or not they've had different types of treatment like BCG, so that they could see if in fact this is a phenomenon that is helping or hurting or neutral? Do you know if they're doing that?
They weren't, but obviously now that the BCG data has become so well known, and as you know, it's got the attention of not just the US, but international press, these databases are including BCG as a variable. So yes, absolutely. We will have sufficient data on BCG with regards to not just bladder, but all different cancers, but clearly in patients that have bladder cancer. But these are registries that are reported by practitioners of patients who are COVID-19 positive. So they're not registries that are capturing COVID-19 negative individuals, because clearly that's, in the hundreds of millions as far as population is concerned. And I do think that the survey questionnaire sort of that you incorporated as part of the registration for this meeting will actually help inform our bladder cancer community of patients and providers a lot as to, what it shows. So I'd be interested to see what our registration from this webinar suggests.
Yes, we'll be sharing the results of what the 87 people that signed up have contributed thus far. And absolutely, I'm sure there may be some ways that, or some ideas that pop out that you want to know more about. We'll be happy to push that out so people can respond, because I think, again, if they're not going to be reporting any people that are COVID negative to this registry, you won't find out if people who are on BCG are ultimately COVID negative. It'll be very interesting to see as they begin to mine that data and they begin to have more and more patients entered into it. So if somebody who's listening has gone through COVID in any way, or they know that they're COVID positive, they can't sign themselves up for the registry, can they? They have to have their doctor do it, correct?
For the actual cancer registry, yes,
Right.
that is correct.
Okay, great. So as far as the idea of, looking and understanding about the vaccine, you've decided to do the trial in healthcare providers. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you're going to be doing this trial? I think patients might know enough about scientific trials from high school that they know a little bit about how trials might progress. We've certainly tried to explain it as an organization to everyone. But what's the structure of this trial going to look like, and how long is it going to be before they have any kind of data that they could use?
Yeah, so let me actually answer that in a little bit broader term, because I'm sure our viewers are very in tune with what's going on, not just in the U.S. but globally. Based on some of these epidemiological studies, including the one that Dr. Hagerty led, there has been a push from several governments across the globe and several groups, even here in the US, to suggest that we should take BCG vaccine and vaccinate everybody at risk. Older individuals, nursing home residents, law enforcement, people in the food industry, and get them out there so they could start working again. And that's because of clearly a specific COVID-19 vaccine is likely going to be 9, 12 plus months down the road. And we all recognize that COVID-19 is likely going to be a seasonal thing and will come back in winter, and combined with the flu, it's going to be, it potentially could overwhelm the US system, just like the Spanish flu did in 1918 when it came back with a vengeance in the cold season. So people are saying, well, if BCG vaccination protects against influenza, and there's anecdotal evidence that people have less flu with the BCG, and now we're suggesting it protects against COVID-19, should you just roll it out to everybody? And we think that that should be phase 2, if at all. In phase 1, we believe that we have to answer this question in a rigorous manner, and the only way to do that is to have a randomized study. Randomize half the population to placebo, half to the intervention, in this case, BCG vaccination. And we don't want to put our community and patients at risk because we don't know what the result will be. So we're targeting healthcare workers who had high risk of exposure to the COVID-19 infection just from being day in and day out in COVID-19 units, taking care of patients. And half the healthcare workers will know that they're getting, well, they'll know that they potentially could get placebo. But we're keeping this initial phase relatively small. It's only about 300 healthcare workers at each institution, so roughly about 1,200 to 1,500 in the US. And we're going through the FDA, regulatory bodies, everything to do it in a strict control manner. It should be, the results should be out pretty relatively quickly, because we will see effects within 3, 4, 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. And clearly, we're planning for the next phase of the reintroduction of the pandemic if it happens to protect people there. But I just want to caution everyone, and I know there are countries and organizations that are rolling out BCG without the umbrella of a trial for everybody that wants to get vaccinated. Personally, I think that that would be too premature. Paul, what do you think?
I agree, and we just don't know. And there is not this window that we have now for getting useful information. Healthcare workers are the ideal target in that they're generally young and healthy, and so that's what we use in a phase 1 trial, is when we check it on healthy individuals. And secondly, because they have a high rate of infection. In my country, in Ireland, 27% of all cases are in healthcare workers. And so because we hopefully will get the answer quickly in that regard. And I think it'd be premature to run ahead. We just don't know. And we also don't know to what extent it protects people. If it protects at all, and does it protect well, does it protect partially? Because we want to know to what extent we can start lifting some of the draconian limitations we have to people now. And so we want to know how good this really is. And giving it in a blanket way like this will be not measurable. If we want to get the maximum information to help countries get back on their feet, both medically and economically, then we need to know really what's the margin of benefit, if at all, to this.
Stephanie, I'm seeing some questions pop up on the list. Do you want me to address those, or will you have us address those?
Well, I'm going to save those a little bit for just a little bit longer. I have a couple other questions to ask first, and then I'll go through those and I'll ask those if you don't mind. That would be fine. I did have a question about why was the Tice strain selected for the vaccine if there are other strains out there, or is the Tice strain only being used in the United States, and why is that? Because
Correct.
that's the strain that our patients use for bladder cancer.
Correct. So globally, countries are able to use whichever BCG is approved in that country for either vaccination or for other purposes. Here in the US, we don't have BCG that's produced for TB vaccination because the incidence of tuberculosis is so low in the United States. And the only BCG that's FDA approved is Tice BCG. So the FDA gave us an IND exemption to use that formulation in the US, essentially. But in other parts of the world, they're using BCG from their local sources. The Serum Institute of India, for example, that produces most of the BCG in the world, is more than happy to provide BCG, even free of cost, for the study in the United States. But it's not something that we can say yes to because it's not approved here and it has to go through the usual FDA regulatory process.
Right. Okay. And yes, they're looking at BCG and other strains in other clinical trials, but those are not even near completion yet to see if that's effective, right? The SWOG trial.
Right. I mean, again, you know, having worked with BCG for close to 2 decades and having talked to people that have essentially worked in BCG for 50 plus years, we don't really believe that there's any true difference between the different strains of BCG. And if the difference exists, it's so minor that it's not worth not being able to use those strains. But again, clearly we have to follow the rules that we have. And if the rules state we have to do a study to get any strain into the US, then we have to do it. And that's where the SWOG study comes in.
Okay. So in the supply chain, what would one dose of BCG that would be used for one patient with bladder cancer do in a vaccine? How many people might be vaccinated with that single dose?
So this was a very important consideration because, as you know, I've been a strong supporter and champion of our bladder cancer community, and that is primarily what I do. I'm not an infectious disease doctor. I'm a urologic oncologist. So it was very heartening for me when speaking to the TB experts and looking at the dose calculations that with 1 vial of BCG that is used to treat a patient with bladder cancer, we could potentially vaccinate 500 healthcare workers. So it's 1 vial versus 2 for 500 people. Now, clearly there's some logistics and, you know, how quickly can you inject, et cetera, et cetera. So even with a little bit of error built into it, up to 300 people, once you get the system going, could be vaccinated with 1 vial. Early on with the 6 feet distancing and the fact that a lot of people will be driving through these centers to get their vaccine and not actually walking up to people like they would for a flu shot. That number might be lower, but to answer your question, from a pure CFU colony forming unit calculation, it's one vial can vaccinate 500 healthcare workers.
Wow, that's a lot of people that could be protected down the road with just the one vial. And is the fact that some patients are being deferred in some locations going to allow it not to necessarily impact the supply for bladder cancer treatments?
You know, to be honest with you, again, we don't want our bladder cancer patients not to have access to BCG if they need it for the higher grade, higher risk bladder cancers. As you know, there are a lot of centers in the US today, and many of my collaborators on the study, that don't have a single vial of BCG, so they can't give it to bladder cancer patients anyways. So that's a problem that's ongoing. The supply chain, and we, and I know you and others have reached out to Merck to see if they could help with the supply chain of BCG, and for some reason, they haven't been, again, I don't know the reason, but the answer has been essentially, no, they're not able to help with this study. So what the sites that have BCG and are enrolling in the study are doing is making sure that we don't sacrifice the ability of patients who truly need BCG for that initial induction just for the trial. And fortunately, as I mentioned, a lot of the guidelines are suggesting that even regardless of the trial, patients who are on maintenance therapy should probably not be getting maintenance therapy because of the risk of COVID-19 just coming to the hospital. So that does open up the supply. And as I mentioned, one vial, so if one patient doesn't get one maintenance therapy, 500 people could be vaccinated. And patients of mine that I've talked to, and I'm sure that you've talked to, Paul, and others, they've all told me, hey, Dr. Kamat, if one vial can help 500 healthcare workers so that they can then be ready to help us when we come back and actually need help, feel free to take my vial away. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is what we're doing, but it's been very heartening to hear that from my own patients.
Dr. Haggerty?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're not at the level of rationing that we have to make those difficult decisions at all, thank God. And so we have enough for it. But I'm really pleased with people's response in general, the generosity of spirit of everybody, that they just want to get it done. So I don't think it's a real issue. And it's great that the ratio is so large with regard to how many people can get it. And I think once we have the information, we have a few months while we're getting these data together for the various countries and regulatory systems to sort out the BCG question. And so maybe in the long term, this will actually be helpful. So the BCG is less of an issue with supply chain going forward for everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point that Paul, you just made, because data speaks for itself. And I suspect that once we have the positive results from the study, and I say positive because I do believe the mechanism, but once we have results from the study, if it's positive, that will put pressure on the supply chain to produce and provide more BCG. And then hopefully we will not have this shortage issue, both for bladder cancer and for vaccination, if that's something we decide to roll out to everybody. Because like I said, there's plenty of BCG in the world. It just doesn't get to certain places because of rules, regulations, which again, I'm not saying we should circumvent, but we do have to sometimes recognize that, benefit can outweigh certain bureaucratic red tape.
Okay. I'd like to take a couple of questions from the participants that are on this call. So understanding BCG does not protect against COVID. If a bladder cancer patient were to get COVID-19, would this make BCG less effective as a treatment against bladder cancer? Do you have any idea, any speculation on that?
Do you want any one of us to answer that?
Either one.
Okay, well, no, bottom line, no. Unless someone is acutely sick with a viral infection, at which point we wouldn't be treating them with any intravesical therapy anyways. Even if somebody has, a symptomatic flu, we do delay BCG therapy. But if someone's had COVID-19 infection and recovered from it, then there is no reason why BCG should be less effective.
Absolutely, I agree. Doesn't make any reason. Yeah.
So understanding that approximately 40% of patients undergoing 6 months of induction of intravesical BCG become PPD skin test positive. Is that correct? Are there any studies that are looking at that as far as, are patients becoming tuberculosis immune because of this, because of the inductions that they've had once they've completed those? Is that a real benefit?
So it's interesting that somebody brought up PPD. PPD is such an old test to detect prior exposure to TB, tuberculosis. And yes, it does cross-react a little bit with the BCG that's used to treat patients with bladder cancer, and if you use it for vaccination. But it's a very non-specific test. And most TB experts will say that people should not be using PPD. I mean, again, there are centers that still use PPD as a test, but there's other tests. The IGRA test, which is the IG, the globulin reactive assay, is much more sensitive, much more precise, and it's very, very inexpensive to do. So short answer, if a particular center or an employee is still using PPD, by all means, you can use it. If the person ends up being positive, either because of BCG put in the bladder or because of BCG vaccination, and again, I was vaccinated at birth or as an infant in India, you can clarify that with an IGRA test so easily that hypothetical situation should not really defer anybody from getting BCG for their bladder cancer or for this study.
Anything to add, Dr. Haggerty?
As long as the person is well, then that's always been a premise with regard to intravesical BCG. If a patient was unwell coming into it, it would have been deferred anyway, and so this changes nothing in that respect. And the fact that PPD becomes positive in the skin is a sign of maybe end organs that their T cells are responding to it. I don't think it necessarily predicts a better outcome or worse outcome, but it's just a sign that it's getting into the system. And what's interesting is that it's not having an effect just in the bladder. And that's what will help us in our studies, in the mechanism of how it works, that affects not just the bladder area, but also perhaps throughout the whole immune system. So that's the whole argument. If it were just that it affected locally, then an injection under the skin should only protect your skin area. So the fact that it generalizes is probably the beneficial mechanisms of most of TB, or most BCG, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me very well into the next question. How is it that BCG vaccination is safe, even though it's systemic in your body, whereas it's considered very dangerous for bladder cancer patients if BCG installation gets into their bloodstream because their TERP hasn't healed necessarily before they have that? Why do you have to wait? Why is this such a big deal? And yet they're saying that it's going to be beneficial if you put it into your bloodstream. So
let me clarify there. TB vaccination, when it's given the way we're doing it for the study against COVID, it's not intravascular. It's not systemic. It's intradermal. It's just underneath the skin with a small puncture right underneath the surface of the skin. And that's the way that it's been given to billions and billions of babies across the world with minimal adverse events. In fact, in Africa, when it's given to millions of babies of HIV positive mothers in the acute setting, the mothers don't get infected with BCG, nor do the babies. So it's very, very safe when it's given in that manner and it's given right underneath the skin. And also, you have to remember that the dose of BCG that's put in the bladder is 500 times that dose. And the bladder has blood vessels, and we've potentially done biopsies and resected the tumor, so there's a raw vascular surface. If I took BCG and injected it directly intravascularly into a subject, that would be fatal. And people tried BCG for melanoma and leukemia and lung cancer back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. It worked really well against the cancer, but it caused a severe infection because they were putting it directly into the bloodstream. So for the trial, it does not go into the bloodstream. It's only put underneath the skin. There's data that it's very safe from millions, if not billions of subjects. And the dose is much, much smaller than what we use for bladder cancer.
Okay, very good point. Dr. Haggerty?
Yeah, and it's a question about dose exposure. while we give BCG, which has some live micro TB effectively in it, it's a very weakened amount of it, and that the idea is to expose a person to a small amount of it. If we were to give a high load of this bacterium into the system, then that would be dangerous, and that's why we have very strict criteria on giving into the bladder, that we wait for the person to have settled down after the resection, and if the catheter passes in and they're bleeding or they have a sign of an infection, it gets suspended for that week, and they don't get it again until they've settled. That's why we have these criteria.
So, Dr. Kamat, you mentioned that you as a baby in India were vaccinated with BCG. I remember, well, I have a scar that shows that I also got the TB vaccine when I was young, as a young child. I don't necessarily remember it, but there are a lot of older Americans that also might have been given this vaccine back in the day. Are they protected, or is there a period of time that it's helpful and then after a while it just doesn't do much of anything and maybe you need a booster like some other vaccines? What do you think about that?
So unfortunately, all of the above, right? There are some people in whom the effect of TB vaccination lasts 5 years, some in whom it can last 45, 50 years. There's no way to know that other than doing, testing for immune cells, et cetera, that we talked about. But just because you have the scar from the TB vaccination at birth does not mean that you can essentially either not need a revaccination. So we're not using that as an exclusion criteria for anybody on the study, even those that were vaccinated with BCG, so long as it's not just within the last year or 2 years, will still be able to get a booster vaccination shot. Number one. Number two, the study that Dr. Haggerty did actually looked at populations that are vaccinated at birth, not just adults. So looking at those correlative studies, and Paul, if you want to elucidate that a little bit more, there is clearly some protective effect, but we can't say it's for everybody. And as Paul, as you mentioned, it's population based, it's not individual, because the individual protection could be 5 years, 40 years, it's variable.
Yeah, like its protection against TB is thought to be 20 years at least. And that's more recent data supports that. But there's so many other potential benefits to it that we don't know which effect wears off, or if it wears off at all. We don't know where the death rate's lower because less kids got it and then didn't pass it on to their seniors. Or is it something that somebody got 80 years ago still affecting them? And it may well be that. So we just don't know. And maybe when we have different arms of the trials from different countries, one done in a country where there's little or no BCG, and then done also in a country where there's a high rate of BCG, but would have been given to a healthcare worker 30 or 40 years earlier, then that will hopefully answer those questions also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is all really important. So given that it takes a long time to develop and grow BCG, it's not a simple thing. Do you know what is being done either locally in the United States or globally to help increase? You mentioned that the Indian supplier seems to have plenty of other strains of BCG. Will those be able to be used elsewhere? Do you think that there's any chance that these other strains could get approval down the road for this vaccine so that it does not tap into the supply of Tice BCG?
Yes, so the Serum Institute of India has two strains. One is the Russian strain that has been in use in many parts of the world for BCG vaccination. And they also have a recombinant BCG that they have worked on for bladder cancer patients. And again, this is data that was going to be presented at the EAU, but because we didn't have the meeting, of course, in Amsterdam, it wasn't presented. But that was developed for patients with bladder cancer who have a recurrent tumor after regular BCG, Tice BCG as a salvage therapy because it's supposed to be stronger, better, faster, et cetera. And again, that's something that they were working on trying to get approved in the US. They have been supplying BCG for similar trials across the globe. And like I said, there are many countries where you can apply to the regulatory bodies and say, we have a shortage of a drug, we have supply of drug, it's not really different, and they do quality control and then they get that approved. Here in the US, we have that mechanism as well, but it's a lot longer and more rigorous. So far, we've not been, we're not using any strain other than Tice in the US.
Great. I think the main last question I wanted to just get into, going back to bladder cancer, as far as if BCG is not available. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the alternatives that might be used in intravesical therapy for populations that would benefit from being treated the way that BCG is going to treat them? Are there other options that can be tapped into? I think that's a big concern for our community. Chemo or anything else?
Sure. Paul, do you want to see what's been done in Europe, and then I could speak to US?
First of all, there's mitomycin C, which is commonly used, and then there's a different way of delivering it, which is called electromotive, where they put a pad on the abdomen and on the tummy, and then it helps to drive the mitomycin deeper into the tissue. Those are the two main ways in Europe, but I know that you're involved in a lot more trials and of other versions and combinations. Maybe you can tell me about the other ones.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. So in patients who can't get BCG for whatever reason, whether decided on by their urologist or they just don't want or can't get BCG, there are other options, fortunately. They're not as good as BCG because BCG is an immunotherapy, and immunotherapy works really well for bladder cancer. We sometimes forget that BCG is the oldest, most effective immunotherapy for cancer, period. Right, because we see a lot of press about the latest drug with IOs, and they only have a 20% success rate, whereas BCG has a 60-70% success rate when used appropriately. But fortunately, we have options that also have a 40, 50, even as high as 60% success rate in some situations that can be used. And again, as Paul mentioned, that's mitomycin, either electromotive or heated. There's combination chemotherapy with mitomycin and gemcitabine. So luckily, our patients have a lot of options. And even though they may not be as good as BCG, they're clearly very, very effective. And I would not recommend no treatment. I would recommend some treatment for bladder cancer always. And if a patient can't get BCG because of supply chain issues in their country, wherever it is, I'm sure they are having discussions with their urologist about an alternative treatment rather than no treatment.
Good. Yeah,
really
I agree.
Very helpful. Very helpful answer. One of our callers is using Dr. Kamat's BCG treatment cystoscopy schedule that we put out through BCAN, and this person is getting their BCG treatment number 19, 20, and 21 in July if it's available. Do you think by then it would be safe to go in and get that in a smaller practice environment rather than coming to a big, large academic hospital that might still be in the throes of COVID-19 treatment?
So first of all, I do want to give a shout out to BCAN and Stephanie and your group for putting that on the website so people can use. It was very sort of frustrating for me because I get patients from all over the country and the world, and I would recommend that they get BCG a certain way, but clearly we can't have them all staying in Houston to get the BCG, so they would go back to where they reside. And then when I saw them back in 3, 4, or 6 months, or even a year just for an annual checkup, I would find that the BCG schedule was all over the place, and it wasn't anybody's fault. It was just the way that it happened. So we came up with the schedule. One of my lead nurses here at MD Anderson, Prasant Abraham, and myself and my team, we came up with this, and we use it for our patients. So it's almost like a little Starbucks card where you can take it and get stamped when you get your BCG. And Stephanie, you were very kind enough to recognize the importance for the community. And now I see a lot of patients who've never seen me come to see me for the first time carrying that with them. So it really helps. Sorry to go about the wrong way, but I do want to thank you for doing that for our patients. But short answer to that question, if you're already on 19, 20, 21, and you've been free of disease for that long, I would only go and get the installation of BCG if it's safe from a COVID-19 perspective. And absolutely, going to any facility where you have qualified individuals, BCG is done so regularly and so routinely in the urologic community that it can be honestly done safely in most centers that offer it.
Okay.
Good.
Excellent. Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions. How far is the trial now? I know you mentioned that it was getting up and running, and that it would probably be about 6 weeks before things really start to show any data. Can you talk about the fact that it has different names in different countries? Is it the same trial?
So I did see one of those questions, and it's ironic. So initially, we physicians called it the BACTIR, BACTIR trial, and it was very scientifically named. And when we were talking amongst ourselves, and my son was overhearing some of my conversations, and then I was talking with some of the patients. He said, "Well, we need a more powerful name." And that's where the BADAS acronym came from. It actually came from recommendations from some patients and kids of the investigators said we need a bad therapy to fix this bad problem. So it's BCG as Defense Against SARS-CoV-2. That's the US acronym for the study. All the old acronyms have been dropped. As far as where it is, again, our regulatory process in the US takes longer than many countries, and I think that's a good plus. I have to commend the FDA that they were so quick with granting us an IND exemption, and many IRBs have moved with this in rapid pace. Just to give our audience some idea, normally trials take anywhere from 9 months to 18 months to get up and running. This trial should be up and running next week, which would be in less than 5 weeks from the idea to implementation. But it's not up and running yet. So we don't have anybody enrolled yet. Nobody's received it, but it should be up and going pretty soon. And obviously, once it gets going, Stephanie, that's what I was saying. It'll be roughly 6 weeks from the time that we first start that we should have data.
So because certain communities have large outbreaks of COVID-19, are you targeting some of the communities where it's not quite as prevalent to see if it has a preventive effect at all? Or are you thinking you can still offer some benefit to the healthcare community, even in places where they've probably already been exposed and just might not have come down with the virus yet?
So now you're asking a great question, and that goes deep into what are we doing as far as testing prior to enrollment, collecting specimen, doing retroactive analyses. All of this will actually be answered once we have the results of this interim look, but we're not restricting communities or healthcare workers or doctors or facilities just based on the prevalence. I know what you're saying. It would obviously be better to get this trial only into areas that have a very high incidence of COVID-19, but I'm sure you saw the study out of California that came out a couple of days ago where they tested everybody in that city. I forget, I think it was LA actually, and they found that 3.9% roughly had evidence that they'd been infected, which was clearly much, much higher than people ever thought. So nobody knows the actual incidence or prevalence of COVID-19 infection, and to restrict groups from participating just because we think it's not good for them, I really don't think that's fair or ethical.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Well, this has been incredibly informative. I think we're kind of at the end of our questions. Do you have any last comments that you would like to make for the group about BCG in bladder cancer, BCG as a vaccine, preventing and hopefully reducing the risk of very serious complications from COVID-19? Anything else?
Paul, I'll let you go.
I think, well, first of all, the BCG has been well proven in its benefit in bladder cancer, and it's great that BCAN are supporting this and allowing a vehicle for patients to discuss and raise their anxieties or concerns. So BCG clearly is beneficial in bladder cancer. It may well be, and hopefully the trials will answer the second question. I think it's great that BCAN is so supportive of our processes, and I'm very pleased to help.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that.
And in closing, again, I do want to again echo what Paul said. Thank you for BCAN for bringing this to the forefront, because I know my patients have questions of me about BCG and the trial and things like that. And this clearly is a platform that's really helpful for patients. And once it's out there in an enduring fashion, they could access it anytime. I do also want to sort of allude to the fact that People do ask me, and I saw a question pop up, is how come urologists are leading the fight against COVID-19? Clearly, urologists have the most experience with BCG in the United States. My collaborators, and in fact, people that brought the idea to me, Andrew Donardo from Baylor College of Medicine, Jeff Cirella from Texas A&M, Megan Murray from Harvard. These are excellent, excellent ID specialists and researchers in the TB field. But when they were faced with this problem, they recognized that BCG is not used in the US other than by urologists and urologic oncologists. And so that's where I got involved, and they approached me. Mihai Nedia from the Netherlands approached me as well. And then of course I reached out to Paul because of the access to the databases. So that's how urologists got involved. And it's clearly, it's up to everybody that can help our patients and the whole COVID-19 community to do whatever we can. So I think it's great that everybody's chipping in and being part of this fight against the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great. I have one more question. Somebody asked, could you again say slowly what the BADAS study stands for?
So it's
They're probably taking notes.
Sure. So B for BCG, A for as, D for defense, A for against, and S for SARS-CoV-2. BCG as defense against SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, most excellent. I do want to let everybody know that we will be making a transcription of today's program, and we will post it along with the video recording of today's program on our website, bcan.org. And on behalf of the bladder cancer community, Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, and the World Bladder Cancer Patient Coalition, for which we are a member, I want to thank you both very much. And I do express my deep gratitude for you coming on and doing this program. And we'll be sharing the information people submitted with our experts. And if they have any follow-up questions, they will reach out to us, and we will reach out to you to see if you might want to participate in whatever informational gathering studies they might be working on about BCG and bladder cancer and COVID-19. So thank you both very much.
My pleasure.